In the north of Burkina Faso, there is a stretch of ground the locals once called dead. Hard as poured concrete, the color of old bone. Nothing had grown on it for years, and the men who owned it had already walked away. Then one man walked back onto it. He carried no tractor, no fertilizer, no aid agency grant. He carried a pickaxe, a basket of manure, and an idea most of his neighbors were certain was madness. His name was Yacouba Sawadogo. He could not read or write, and on soil the agronomists had formally written off. He would spend the next 40 years growing a forest. To understand why that was nearly impossible, you have to understand what had happened to this land. This is the Sahel, the great dry belt, where the Sahara loosens its grip on the rest of Africa. In the 1970s and 80s, the rains simply stopped coming. Drought settled over the region for years. Crops failed, wells dried, and hundreds of thousands of people abandoned their villages and headed south to survive. In Yacouba's home region of Yacouba, the topsoil didn't just dry, it hardened. Bare ground, baked by sun and stripped by wind, formed a crust called zypele. When rain finally fell, it couldn't sink in. It ran straight off, like water off glass. This is the cruel trap of desertification. The land is too hard for water to enter, so nothing grows. And because nothing grows, there are no roots to soften the land. Each failed harvest makes the next one harder. The obvious solutions all failed here. Government schemes brought in heavy machinery and imported seed. But you cannot bulldoze a healthy soil into existence, and thirsty modern crops died in ground that couldn't hold a drop. So Yacouba did the opposite of modern. He reached back to a technique so old most farmers had abandoned it as a relic. It was called zai. Zai is almost insultingly simple. You dig a small pit in the hardpan, about the width of a dinner plate. Then you fill it with compost and manure. Then you plant your seed inside it. That's it. The pit does two quiet jobs. It catches the rain that would otherwise run away, funneling it down to a single seed. And it catches the wind, trapping blown dust and seeds, and organic scraps that slowly enrich the whole. But Yacouba changed the old recipe. He dug his pits wider and deeper than tradition allowed, and he packed them with far more manure than anyone thought sensible. His neighbors laughed. They said he was wasting good compost on dead ground. What they didn't understand was that Yacouba wasn't just feeding the seed. He was setting a trap for termites. The extra manure drew the termites in, and termites, it turns out, are engineers, hunting for the buried organic matter. They tunnel down through the concrete hard, crust the very layer that stopped the rain. Those tunnels become channels. Now rain doesn't run off, it pours down into the ground and stays. The termites also digest the manure, unlocking nutrients and leaving the soil softer and richer than they found it. The pest everyone curses became the plow Yacouba couldn't afford. It worked. In the first pits, millet and sorghum came up green while the surrounding plains stayed dead. But Yacouba did something the aid projects never had. He didn't only plant food crops in his pits. He planted trees. Seeds of acacia, baobab, shea, and dozens of native species went into the ground alongside the grain. The trees anchored the soil through shade, dropped leaves, and pulled the water table back up. Slowly, the land began to remember how to be alive. Not everyone welcomed it. Land in the Sahel is contested, and a growing forest on worthless ground suddenly had value. At one point, part of Yacouba's land was seized and split for housing. He kept planting anyway. Year after year, pit after pit, the forest grew. Not a plantation, a wild, tangled woodland. By its maturity, it covered around 40 hectares and held more than 60 species of trees and bushes, some of them locally rare. Animals returned. Birds nested. Villagers came to gather firewood, fruit, and medicinal plants they'd thought were gone forever. One man with a pickaxe and a theory about termites had built an ecosystem. And here is the part that matters most. The idea didn't stay in Gourga. Yacouba refused to keep it secret. He held open days, handed out seeds, and taught anyone who came his improved zai, pit by pit. Researchers began to take notice, among them the Dutch scientist Chris Rage, who spent decades documenting what Sahelian farmers were quietly achieving. Combined with simple stone contour lines that slow the runoff further, the technique spread across the region. The numbers are genuinely startling. Across Burkina Faso's central plateau alone, Farmer-led methods like these have rehabilitated on the order of 200,000 to 300,000 hectares of degraded land, producing roughly 80,000 extra tons of food a year. That is not a rounding error in a famine zone. That is food for hundreds of thousands of people, grown on ground the experts had crossed off the map using a tool no more sophisticated than a hoe, some manure, and patience. In 2018, the world finally caught up with him. Yacouba Sawadogo was awarded the Right Livelihood Award, often called the Alternative Nobel. The illiterate farmer stood on an international stage. They had started calling him the man who stopped the desert. He died in late 2023 in his late 70s. But the forest he grew from nothing is still standing, and the technique he refused to keep to himself is still being dug into hard ground, pit by pit, across the Sahel. There's a temptation to make this a story about one extraordinary man, but the more useful lesson is quieter. The solution to a crisis modern science struggled with was old, cheap, local, and waiting to be believed in. The Sahel is not doomed to become the Sahara. Yacouba proved that a degraded landscape can be coaxed back to life, not by conquering it, but by working with the rain, the wind, and even the termites already living in the soil. If you want the full breakdown how the Zai pit actually works, the real restoration figures, and how the method is spreading now, I've put the sources and the deeper story in the link below. Start with a hole in the ground. It's a better place to begin than you'd think.